Hi there, my name is Shannon and I am with Career In. And today I have my guest speaker, Charlyne Fothergill, joining me to share some insights on working in technology.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. My name is Charlyne. I am an HR professional and have been in HR for the past 15 years. I have worked in a variety of industries. I started my career in advertising and then moved actually working for a building engineer firm, so very traditional organization, and then fell into tech, took a position in tech and absolutely fell in love. And I've been in tech and specifically in Canada's tech startup scene for the past decade. So I've done a bunch of different things in the tech startup scene. I've obviously worked in HR for companies. I'm currently the senior HR business partner at CTO.ai, which is a really early stage company creating a developer tool. And I also ran a Grow Lab, an accelerator program called Grow Labs, which was VC backed. And accelerator programs are a little bit kind of like Dragon's Den, where companies pitch. We take a little bit of equity from them in order to support their business, give them a lot of mentorship, put some programming on there to help them accelerate their business. So I did that for 3 years, and I'm still super involved with various organizations in the tech scene. So I'm really excited to be here today on this recording. Apologies, I can't be there in person to share with you all a little bit what the heck it means to work in tech and what is this tech industry that everyone talks about, and a little bit of insight into potentially how to get your foot in the door if that's what you'd like to do with your career. Awesome. So I'm going to go through this presentation and then Shannon's going to ask me some questions at the end. Wonderful. All right. So hi, I'm Charlyne. There's my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. All right. So what is it like to work for a tech company? So everyone's talking about tech companies. We all know the big ones: Amazon, Facebook, Shopify. You know, the list is long. Microsoft. Of these, this is what we think of when we think of tech companies. But actually, the question we should be asking, or what we should be acknowledging first off, is what is a tech company? And the bottom line is that every company is a tech company, and every tech company is actually a company. So for you folks that are technical on this presentation, it really changes your job prospects and how you think, because every company is hiring developers. Every company is a tech company. And if you aren't technical, the point being that every tech company is hiring the same positions as every other company. So the good news is this way of thinking of tech companies, it means the job prospects are really high. And tech companies, so those Amazons and all that sort of things, yes, they hire devs, data analysts, QA, but they also hire HR, accountants, marketing, admin, ops, etc. These tech companies have some cultures are more modern than others. I know there's a lot of thinking that tech companies have really modern cultures. We think of the lunchroom and work from home and all that stuff. And the fact is, some have really modern cultures, but other tech companies have less modern cultures. And then companies using tech, so places like London Drugs, Superstore, Best Buy, Lululemon, these aren't traditionally tech companies, but they are highly enabled with tech. And realistically, all companies these days have a tech component. Even places like Ernst & Young and banks and big accounting firms and big consulting firms, they are all using tech. So they hire devs and data analysts and QA and those technical roles that you might not think of when you're looking for a job in tech. And of course, they also hire HR, accountants, marketing, admins, ops, etc. And some of these cultures are more modern than others. So there's, again, this stereotype of large, more traditional companies have these stuffy corporate cultures, and that's not necessarily the case. Some do, but some large tech companies have more corporate or kind of big company type cultures, and some large companies have more modern or kind of more fluid type culture. So really it's all about just finding that first job and getting your foot in the door. And the good news is there's lots and lots of options. All right. So what's it like to work for a tech startup? So when I think of tech companies, obviously I think all companies are tech companies and all tech companies are companies. But when I really try to find a differentiator, it really comes down to the tech startup. And there are some things that are inherently different when you work for a tech startup. So first off, let's call out some of the stereotypes in working for a startup culture or a startup. So some of the stereotypes that I've often heard in recruiting and hiring for these, as well as working with these, and stereotypes are sometimes grounded in a little bit of truth, is sometimes there's this thought that a startup is going to have a culture of beer and ping pong tables, or a work hard, party hard culture, or even negatively a bro culture. And there's been a lot of news, especially in the States, around these kind of really negative cultures that come from tech and kind of those tech startups that maybe were small and have grown into really big companies. So the small problems turned into big, large problems. And that's not always the case. These are stereotypes. Some of the other stereotypes are long hours, no or low pay, no benefits, having a 21-year-old CEO, which for some people could be really exciting. I'm 40 years old, so I don't know if I'd want to go work for a 21-year-old CEO doing his first company, but other people, it could be a really great experience. And there's also the stereotype that a company will go bankrupt. And so the bottom line is, no two companies are the same. So absolutely, in my experience working with tech startups, there are companies that have more of that beer and ping pong table type culture. And again, for some people listening to this, you're like, that sounds really fun. I'd love for my first job to be in a bit more of a casual kind of culture where there's a work hard, play hard, everyone gets together, everyone goes to the pub afterwards, post-COVID, that sort of thing. But for other people, that doesn't sound really that great. And all to say, it is a stereotype, and not all startups, one size doesn't fit all for all startups. Same with long hours, no pay, low pay, no benefits. It really depends on the startup. It depends on the stage of the company, depends on how small the company is, and it really depends on the company's money status. So CTO.ai is a venture-backed company. So we actually raised $8 million a year and a half ago. So we have plenty of money to spend on good pay for people, make sure that we have benefits and proper vacation time and things in place. But yeah, if you're a smaller company or a little bit more cash strapped, or just trying to figure those things out, or haven't raised money, budgets might be tighter, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every startup doesn't have pay or can't pay competitively. So these are just stereotypes to be mindful of if you were kind of thinking startups aren't for me for these reasons. Some companies, yes, other companies, not so much. Perfect. So what are some of the benefits of working with a startup? So I love working with a startup. I went from my first job was in advertising, which was definitely a work hard, play hard culture. It was a lot of young people, a lot of salespeople, and it was a lot of fun. Being 24 years old, right out of university, and that was my first job. I wouldn't have traded it for the world. Not so much what I want to do now, but it was a really cool experience. I then worked for a really traditional engineering firm that did building engineering. I wasn't such a good fit there. And then I fell into tech. And it was a 60-person company. They were getting ready to grow. And that's where I really fell in love with working for startups. And some of the benefits I learned right away, and then have continued on through my career, are one, it's a great way to start your career. So I joined startups a little later in my career. I was already intermediate to senior, but I've hired lots of junior people and I've worked with lots of companies. And I can definitely say that startups, when they hire junior people, as a junior person, you often have huge ownership. So you get these big roles, you get a chance to really see stuff that at a larger company, it might be reserved for more senior staff, or you might get to work on part of it. But the whole process really is spread across a junior, intermediate, and senior. And really in a startup, you often get to own a lot of things. Another really cool thing about working for a startup is access to the CEO and senior staff. So in large companies, you usually report into a middle manager, and then there's multiple layers above, depending how big the company is. So it's really hard to get time with that really senior person, or even get time with the CEO. But in a startup, you often have direct access to them. It's often very casual. The CEO is willing to give you all the time they have for things, and you really get to learn from different people in the organization. You get the ability to see and touch all areas of the business. So like I said, big companies are very structured, as they have to be. There's hundreds of people to organize workflow. But in a small company where it's a lot more flat and the work is kind of going out the door to one or two people, you really get to see how all the business works. So if you're someone who's really interested in business in general, which I am, it's really cool because you actually get to see what a sales team does, and you get to hear some of that reporting, and you get to see kind of under the hood of that department where normally you wouldn't get to do. So it's a great way to one, see different areas of business, or if you're a little bit more of a generalist that hasn't really figured out what area of the business you want to work in yet, it's a great way to be able to kind of get exposure and see different areas and maybe even try them out and maybe even move from, the admin department or general admin position into sales or into marketing or into HR. And there's a lot of movement that can happen in a startup, much more than in a larger company that, has defined career buckets, so to speak. You also have the ability to propose and take initiative. If you have a great idea, a startup usually isn't going to tell you no. They're going to, want you to run with those ideas. And that can be really exciting. And on that, you get to make a direct impact on your job. The other thing with startups, pros and cons, is usually not a lot of processes set up. So there's a lot of problem solving versus in a larger company that's a little bit more established, you're really going to be given the playbook or the training manual of how to do the certain things. So in HR, for example, in a startup, they might not have a recruitment process set up. Or they have a really loose one. So you can really go in there and bring your ideas about what candidate experience should be and help design some of those interview processes and programming, where again, a larger company, you're going to be trained on how that company does recruiting. And it's not to say that's a bad thing. It's just, this is some of the stuff I found really exciting about working for a startup. Lots of opportunity to grow in the company. Startups are generally by nature growing. So the earlier you get in, the more growth you will see. And obviously someone's got to do those growth jobs. So there's often opportunity to advance really quickly and take on more and more responsibility. Oftentimes there is a more casual culture. The culture can be usually defined more by the staff, and it can be a little bit more grassroots, smaller teams. People generally work really closely together, lots of cross collaboration. So the cultures tend to be a little bit more casual. That doesn't always mean that's the case, but in most cases, in my experience, that's happened. That's definitely a benefit if you like a more casual culture. And then the one great thing about working in a startup is employee stock options. So employee stock options give you a piece of the company so that if the company is successful, you actually get cash for those stock options. So it's a way to kind of invest in the future of the success of the company. And when all staff have ESOP, which most startups offer, the point is that we're all working together for the success of the company. And when the company is successful, because of all of our hard work, we all benefit from it. And ESOP can be invaluable, or it could be not valuable, and as well, it can be very valuable. So it really depends. But overall, ESOP is a great extra perk to working in a startup for sure. All right. So on the flip side of that, startups are definitely not for everyone. When I do recruiting, I really believe recruiting is about matchmaking. So I don't like to call them the cons of working for a startup, because when I read this list, this is actually why I love working for startups, but I like to call them the realities of working for a startup. And it's really up to you to have a think about if this list of things gets you excited, then maybe you should work for a startup. Or if this list of things really doesn't sit well with you, then it's a good indication that maybe at least for your first job, you might want to look into a more established company. So one of the realities of working for a startup is expect it to be fast-paced with lots of change. There's lots going on, and it can often feel really chaotic. So if you're somebody that really needs process and routine and someone to tell you what the heck to do, you may or may not find that working at a startup. The other thing is a startup, the training may be really limited. So again, how do you learn? How do you learn best? If you're someone that, again, needs things documented, you need to listen and review things, or the nature of your job just requires that. I think working for, being an accountant in a startup would be a little bit harder than maybe being HR or a salesperson in a startup. Those jobs don't require so much structure for you to be successful, but the training may be limited. You might be training as you go. You might be figuring a lot of things out on your own. There's often not clear processes. There's a lot of ambiguity in the direction of the job. And then that job and that direction changes really quickly. And sometimes the communication on that change isn't super clear. So you really got to be able to roll with those punches and be flexible and find those realities exciting and and see them as an opportunity for job growth. The other thing about startups is cross-functional management. So early startups, especially, the demographic might be quite young. So management often isn't super experienced. The other thing is, even when the demographic isn't young, you are often being managed by a person who's not your area of expertise. So when I worked at Grow Lab, which it was a company, it was two people and an executive director and a board, but I had a marketing coordinator underneath me. I'm not a marketing expert. I didn't go to school for marketing. I know what I know because largely I work in startups and have paid attention, but I had someone who was junior to me that reported into me who handled our marketing. So she had to be really comfortable with, showing me things for approval and me asking kind of sometimes stupid questions. Also, the fact that she's going to be more of an expert in that area of marketing than me as her manager. And I was her manager. I was her boss. I had to approve her work. And, I was held accountable for that approval, even though I wasn't an expert in management. So that can really happen a lot. And again, for some folks, not a big deal. I started my career, my first HR boss was in Montreal and I was in Vancouver. I was really comfortable with being away from my boss and not necessarily having someone to directly learn from every day. I am now in a situation where I report into the CEO and COO, so they don't necessarily not know about HR, but they aren't experts in my field. And I'm really comfortable with that. Someone else might really want that first job to learn from a more senior person. And that can happen at a startup, but you just have to ask the right questions. The employee processes may or may not be fine. So things like vacation and sick days, sometimes startups, they haven't written all that stuff down. So they could be in place. Or when you ask for a sick day or ask for some kind of leave, parental leave or something, it may be the first time they're dealing with that situation. And, they'll deal with it and they'll do so correctly, but you have to kind of work with them on those processes. So sometimes some of those finer details that maybe we take for granted at a more established company aren't in place. So budgets are often tighter. Again, it doesn't mean they don't pay their employees or they don't pay competitively, but sometimes your marketing budget might be tighter. You don't have money for all the fancy tools and things like that. And you got to kind of figure things out and do a lot with a little. That's often common. And then the other thing is it's high risk, high reward. So stability, long-term stability, job stability of a startup can be less. The benefit of that is if the startup's really successful, you have ESOP and everyone wins. But there definitely is, a bigger chance of, the company going under, to be completely blunt. Again, not every startup. Our startup is very well funded. We have money for at least the next few years. So if you join today, there's a few years of runway. But if you're joining a few years from now, and depending where we're at with our next round of raising money, that becomes a higher risk. So just understanding that that's a factor as well. So one of the quotes I love by Steve Jobs is a small company depends on great people much more than a big company does. And this is kind of why I love working for startups. It's that impact and that influence you get to have. And just that every position, regardless if you're junior or very senior, is so important to a startup. And I just think that lends to really, really great experience. Awesome. So Charlyne, do you think I should work for a startup? What everyone's asking me after talking about it. So my honest advice to all of you new grads, newer job seekers, people back on the job hunt, I think that a startup is it's a flavor that you like or you don't. So in my presentation, when I talk to you about those realities and the good things about it, if that got you really excited, then I think you should absolutely go and try to work for a startup. You don't have a lot to lose. If that stuff gave you a knot in the pit of your stomach, maybe a startup's not a good thing for your first job. It doesn't mean you're never going to go work for a startup, but maybe this first job, you want to go work for a larger company or just a more established company that maybe has some more senior management or structure to it. And that's okay. Sometimes I think that the tech industry gets very polarizing. It's either super sexy, and if you don't want to work in it, something's wrong with you, you're old and boring, or it's seen as this terrible, scary place to be. So I think that really it's an independent choice. And I think that you can't go wrong. And at the beginning of your career, I don't think you can make a career mistake. So if this sounded interesting to you, go for it. And, if it doesn't work out, that's okay. Go make your second job a larger company. But you might be like me and you'll work for a smaller company once and have no interest in working for a larger company. But I've also seen the reverse happen. So I think you should, at this point in your career, you should try different things. I think honestly, at this point in your career, your priority should be getting a job. So being really open to those opportunities, but definitely if you're not feeling it, then don't do it. And there's no shame in that. And you can always go work at a startup later on. Awesome. So job searching tips for working in a tech startup. So for those that would like to potentially see if they can find a job in a tech startup. Awesome. So how to land a job. So first off, insert all of the standard job hunting advice that you've been getting throughout your university and that sort of stuff. Plus, here are a few tips and tricks that are really specific to the tech in the startup scene. So one, startups often do what's called opportunistic hiring. So basically not all jobs are advertised. So for example, if somebody reached out to me today and they were really passionate about our product and they gave me some idea of how we could utilize our skills, I'd probably entertain it. We do have some positions open and I kind of know what positions are coming up in the future, but I also have a whole list of positions that don't exist and I don't really know what they look like yet. So startups are often really open to just hearing what skills you bring to the table and then going, yeah, we could use those skills right now. Why don't you come in for an interview? HR was like that for me at CTO.ai. I knew the founder from before. He was in my portfolio Grow Up company, and I was looking to change and get back into HR from Lighthouse Labs, where I was doing a few different things. And I emailed him and I said, hey, I looked on LinkedIn. It doesn't look like you have a senior HR person. I knew what his company was up to. I really liked him, really liked the company. And I just said, hey, is this an opportunity worth exploring? And he replied back and he's like, I haven't really thought about this position yet, but I know I need this position. And you know what? I think you'd be great for this position. Let's start the interview process. And then I had to meet all the leadership team. We had to figure things out together. But the point is, if I hadn't put that email out to him, he wouldn't have posted for my position for maybe months and months and months. And I never would have known, and I wouldn't have this job right now. So don't be afraid to reach out to people. And that's the next point of that, making a connection. So it's all about connections in startups, partly because they don't often have HR people constantly recruiting. So if you go up to them and you talk to them or you get to know them when they are hiring, even if they're not hiring right now, they'll know you, they'll think of you, and it's just easier to hire someone or put someone through the interview process you've already met with versus reading through resumes and getting to know people on paper. So make connections in your local community. The great thing about Vancouver and Toronto and just Canada in general is we're pretty small and our startup ecosystems are really easy to get into. So make sure you're reaching out to organizations that support startups. Post-COVID world, there's going to be events again. That's a great way to meet companies. But don't be afraid to start making those connections and doing your research and seeing who's interesting to you. Be proactive in your follow-up. So if you do go for an interview process or you do have an exciting job-related conversation with somebody you connect with, you're probably going to have to prompt them. Hey, it's me. I loved our conversation last week. Just curious how that junior dev job is shaping up, or just curious if you're looking to add that HR person onto your team. You're going to have to ask because oftentimes, unless there's a dedicated HR person, those people having the conversations are wearing so many different hats, they often don't have the time to kind of follow up. So it feels a little pushy maybe, but don't be afraid to send a polite email and just ask about things. Or if you've had an interview, you don't hear back from them for 2 weeks, it doesn't mean they didn't like you. Honestly, startup people, they wear so many hats. And even in HR, some of it is I just haven't caught my CEO to talk to him about your interview. I could have loved you, but my CEO is running around like crazy. And when you ping me though, I'm like, oh, right, I got to ask. And I maybe go find them and make a point of doing that because I get busy too. So don't be afraid to follow up. Show your interest and passion. This is huge for startups. We want people that are as passionate about what we're doing. It's all about passion. It has to be a group of people that are super excited to work for this company because there's risk. We've got a lot going on. So having passion is really huge. So make sure you do your research. Make sure you know what the product is. If you can download it from the App Store or get a demo and actually play with the product, that's huge. Go into the interview having an opinion about the product, making them know that you've checked it out, that you understand their tool as best you can. If it's super technical, that's cool, but then at least have that opportunity. We really look for passion in startups versus people just looking for a job. Don't be afraid to show your entrepreneurialism. That's a huge thing of working for a startup. And many startups are totally fine with people having side hustles. So if you had your own little business or you did a little bit of consulting on the side, or you took these really cool initiatives in university, put them on your resume, bring them up in the interview. That entrepreneurialism or intrapreneurialism, as sometimes it's called, is really, really valuable. And then the other thing, if you want to work in tech, even if you want to work for a company using tech or a tech-enabled company, consider taking a basic coding or data course. This is a really great way just to have an understanding what the heck tech is. If you're going to work in HR and you're hiring developers, understanding the difference between front end and back end code and how they talk to each other, or even some basics of certain languages, is hugely beneficial. And putting that on your resume as a junior really helps you stand out from the crowd. So especially if you're not technical normally. So I definitely would encourage those folks that aren't already in technical professions to take some basic courses. There's so many that are free online. You just need to show that you've kind of got some interest in it. And then, there are coding boot camps. Lighthouse Labs is a Canadian-based one that I used to work for. They have part-time programs, both in data analytics, as well as front end, and I think back end, and maybe app development. I'm not sure they took that one off, but just great opportunities to enhance your resume with certain skills relevant to tech. Awesome. So that's me. And that's a little bit of a crash course in working in tech and working for startups and how to maybe start your career in tech startups.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to follow up with a few questions. So I think one of the big things is you talk about culture, and there's a different culture between that traditional kind of established bigger organizations and then the startups. Do you find that there's like a common, I guess I would say, like culture within, or like a key difference between the two that's easily identified?
Yeah, I think the main culture difference I see stems from that lack of process. So, and that fast movement. So in a startup, if you wanted to make a change, or if you had an idea, there's not so much red tape. There's not so many steps in order to have something approved. And in a bigger company, there just is these steps, and they're for good reason. I'm not slagging on big companies in any way, shape, or form. It's like, my startup hopefully will grow to a big company. I'll be part of that process. But I know as an HR person, I'm going to have to start putting things in place and getting a little bit more systematized in how I approach stuff. So when I say culture, I mean the way work is done. I can talk a little bit more of the people side and kind of the fuzzy culture, I guess, but culture as essence is just how work is done. And I find that startups are usually a little bit more nimble, a little more agile. You can be a little bit more creative. Like I said before, if you're junior, your voice matters a little bit more, because you often might be the only person in the marketing department. My marketing coordinator at Grow Lab, whatever idea she had for marketing, I was like, cool, you have an idea for our website? Does it cost us any money? Okay, I'll get budget for it, or whatever. It's just, there's so much more freedom and less steps and less bureaucracy. And I also find the people, those seniors and the CEO, it's just, there's less hierarchy in general, just because there can't really be, when there's only 10 or even 20 people, the CEO can't really sit on their throne and expect to be so much better than everybody else, when everyone's really doing the same type of job and everyone's wearing so many different hats. There's less of that hierarchy on that side of culture. On the people side of culture, like I mentioned, definitely more of a casual environment. There's, usually not a dress code. Tech itself tends not to have a dress code. However, I think at like SAP and Microsoft, there's dress codes. So bigger companies, maybe more so. And I think it's just, there's more of that push to, it's more anti-establishment. And when we think of how tech companies came to be, and we all think the Social Network movie about Mark Zuckerberg, it was meant to be like, I'm a university dropout and I started this company, is kind of meant to be a little bit of anti-establishment. So that culture tends to still be a little bit more casual, a little bit more employee experience, a little bit cooler. That's why there often is ping pong tables and beer fridges and pool and that kind of thing, especially in those larger companies, but even smaller companies often will have those kind of options for folks. And it just stems from the place of trying to be a little more cool, collaborative, everyone on the same equal playing field. Yeah,
I love that. So for me personally, I'm interested. I love what you presented. And I'm just thinking to myself, I'm like, what for me, because you talk about like, it's like a love, like relationship almost, or matchmaking. Yeah. So for me, on like the opposite side, if I'm wanting to kind of get my foot in the door with tech, how do I pick what type of tech or what startup would be best for me? Would it be kind of solely everything's still developing? So am I trying to pull that mission and vision, the traditional value side of it? Or is there kind of a hidden secret, we'll call it, to find the right one?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning stages of your career, I think, you don't really know what you don't know, right? And you don't know what you want or don't want. So if you can narrow it down and go, okay, I think I want startups. That's a great place to start. Then I would just say, get out there and try to find the job. And, in researching the product, you're naturally going to become more excited about some products. And startups do post their jobs. Not every startup doesn't, but just don't limit yourself to the job posting. If you, in researching or going to an event, you see a startup that looks interesting and you play their product and you're really passionate about it, feel free to reach out. You never know, you might get a job out of the deal. So I think it's just be really open. And I think your first job, whether it's a big company or a small company or tech or not, just also understand that every company is different. So even if your first startup experience is, say, terrible, say you hate it, it doesn't necessarily mean that's all tech startups. And that's kind of what I hope everyone takes mostly from the presentation of, well, there are some commonalities. An individual business is still an individual business, and you might find all of that chaos at a large established company. I've definitely seen large established companies that are really chaotic, and you wouldn't know that you're not at an early stage startup once you get in the doors. And some startups are just a little bit more structured right from the get-go for whatever reason. So I think your first job, you can't make a career mistake. Get out there, try to find the job. There's no decision to make until you literally have a job offer in front of you. So don't not apply to a job opening that is interesting and potentially a fit for you because you're anticipating all the things. Just apply or go to that career fair or reach out to that founder, have a coffee, have a Zoom chat. And you can make a decision if that job is for you after you have a chance to ask a lot of questions and after there's actually a job offer in front of you.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I know we mentioned stereotypes and you talked about kind of the traditional, you think beer pong tables and beer and it's so fun and life is great. But do you feel there's almost, I guess, a reason to break the stereotype because that isn't necessarily the case? Or you're just like, I love what I'm doing, think what you want, and that's fine with me?
Yeah. So like, should a company try to break that stereotype?
I think it's almost part of like when it's a stereotype, right? Like society is just assuming. So do you feel like there's almost something to prove, or when they're successful, they're successful? So
yeah, I mean, I think that stereotype of beer pong and that kind of culture is limiting for a company because it's a very short-term seasonal thing. So like I said, starting my career in my 20s in HR in an advertising agency, I mean, it was Mad Men. Like if anyone's watched that show, it literally was cocktail parties and networking events and booze flowing, and they were fancy. Like it was ridiculous. Like things were rented, and the parties were crazy because it was all salespeople trying to make connections, and I got to go to them because our company hosted some, and we just went to them. So that to me was like almost equivalent to that beer pong culture. And like I said, that was really fun in my 20s, and everyone I worked with was in our 20s, some of us in our early 30s. So I think that can work at that point. But it was interesting with that advertising agency. I was there for 4 years. And as everyone got older, the culture naturally shifted. People started getting married, people started having kids, everyone started getting older. So it's like all of a sudden everyone's priorities shifted and the culture they wanted to be involved with shifted. So I think if a company, if you have a young team and that's what makes that team really happy, cool, that can work. But just be mindful that like as a 30-year-old and as a 40-year-old, I'm not joining that company or culture. That's not attractive to me anymore. No judgment. Like I said, your 20s, go get involved with a startup with a 21-year-old CEO who's like all into that. That works for you. Cool. But that company, if I was their HR person, I'd be like, this is a short-lived strategy because eventually we're going to need to hire some 30 and 40-year-olds. And by that, I don't mean age. It means people with experience. I should clarify. So senior people who have more experience are naturally going to be older. They may not be attracted to that. So does that limit our ability to grow as a company? And then more often than not, companies naturally evolve. And if you've set such a strong culture, are you all of a sudden evolving? And the employees that really love that culture, are they like, oh, what do you mean we can't just goof around and have this super casual culture, post raising $7 million, your investors are like, like, let's get to work, people. Your deliverables are a little bit more important now that the company's raised all this money, and that culture might not lend itself to kind of those new expectations.
Right. And I think another thing that I want to touch on that you said was it's almost like a spoiler alert. You don't have to be a technical person to work in tech.
Absolutely.
But did you naturally feel like there was that transition where you're like, you know what, I am a tech person now, and this is kind of that switch in mentality?
Yeah. So for me, and I think a lot of people, I fell into tech. So I was working at a building engineering firm that I was not a fit with the culture. It was just way too formal of a culture. I'm loud. I'm pretty informal. I'm pretty casual. Jeans day was like once a month. It was just not, it was very structured, a lot of red tape, didn't match who I was as a person. So I honestly left to work at a tech company simply because they offered me the job. I was pretty unhappy. Someone offered me a maternity leave contract. I was like, sure. Like I was hiring technical people, like already engineers, a different type of engineer. So I felt really confident that I could learn how to hire developers, and I could work with developers because they're engineers. They're just different. So I'd worked with that group before. So I did have some confidence going into tech, but I didn't know what to expect. And I honestly was pleasantly surprised, and I really fell in love with it. And I fell in love with the stage of company. So it was like similar to my first company, a smaller company, really innovative. I loved that aspect. But unlike the sales and advertising, everyone in sales and advertising is just really, really cool. And I'm just not that cool. And I never really felt like I fit in. And in tech, it was like, I'm surrounded by these incredibly smart people, and everyone's just a little bit quirky. And I kind of liked it. It just kind of fit with me. I'm a little bit quirky. I found that like people appreciated my energy more. I was often the person with the highest energy, which I kind of liked. I love being the like a little bit of a cheerleader in the tech company because I work mostly with introverts. So it was just a really nice fit. And like in finding those people, I was just like, this is my home. Like, I feel really strongly. I mean, I'll never say never, and I'll take a great job opportunity if one comes up in my career, but I will focus my career search in tech moving forward, and probably tech startups, just because I like working with engineers. I like the bulk of the company being engineering, which is different than like having an engineering department. So I just really like that. And like I said, I just kind of found my people.
That's amazing. And then I actually had some questions submitted from my peers. So I'm just going to pull a couple of those.
Yeah.
So one of the big ones was, you kind of answered it, but the high risk, high reward. So is there I guess almost like a red flag, or like something that you can be like, you know what, I'm not feeling secure in this, and like, that's okay? Or is there almost like, you've got to be a risk taker to do it?
Yeah. So as an employee, you're less of a risk taker for sure. I mean, starting your own company is the biggest risk ever. Yeah. So as an employee, you obviously are protected by employment standards. If they've shut the door, they're supposed to do certain things. But at the end of the day, I think the biggest shift, and it's going to sit differently with different people, is job security in our generation isn't about the company anymore. I mean, I do have friends that have worked for the same company for 15 years. I've worked for 5 companies in 15 years. My husband's worked for one company for 12 years. Like, he thinks I'm crazy. He's like, oh, Char's switching jobs again. So, but I think I'm more normal than he is. I think the average person, especially a little bit younger of a generation, is you're going to switch jobs a lot, and your job security isn't tied to a company anymore. And some people think that, oh, I go work at Amazon, or maybe Amazon's a little bit more stable, but I go work at a big, large company. But you can be let go for any reason at any time. And the first company I worked in, the advertising company, it was 180 people across Canada. I'd been there 3.5 years. And then 2008 hit, which was the global recession. And I got laid off during the recession. And it really was like a good learning. And it was nothing to do with my performance. Like, the CEO called me the next day and was like, I'm sorry, I want to thank you. Put me down directly as a reference. So, your job stability is never tied within a company. Your job stability becomes your experience and your network. And that's a really big thing. And that's the one thing I'd say, invest in making connections. And that's going to feel easier to some people than others. And it doesn't have to mean you're like a salesperson, you're spamming everyone, but start to join groups, start to maybe join an organization. If you're in HR, join an HR organization or a little meetup group, and start to make connections, because finding a job, especially in startups, is a lot about who you know. And, I told the story of how I found this job. So Grow Lab was I actually applied for a job. But when I moved to Lighthouse Labs after Grow Lab, Lighthouse Labs was a partner at Grow Lab. They were hiring, we were hiring their students. Our portfolio companies were hiring their students. And Grow Lab actually went through a merger. And in that, I was like, okay, I'm not sure if I'm going to stick around after this merger. I'm not sure, but I'm going to put my feelers out there. And I had a conversation with Lighthouse Labs, and it was kind of the same thing where the timing is right. And they're like, oh, no, we just hired an ops person. They told me, like, we just hired this person. We don't have a job for you. And I was like, okay, no problem. And I'm like looking around town, talking to people, just letting people know I was job hunting. And then, 2 days later, the founder of Lighthouse Labs approached me and was like, hey, listen, like, do you want to set up our career services department? We actually are going to double down on that area of the business. We just had a strategic offsite. Like, would you like to do it? I can't think of anyone else who would be crazy enough to do it, in all honesty, but it was very exciting for me at the time. And I was like, yeah. So that job came from a connection. My current job came from a connection. Working in parallel of applying to generally, I definitely did general applications. But yeah, at this point in my career, if I were to, if CTO.ai goes under, which is very true, it could, my stability is within the experience I've gained so far in my career and at CTO.ai, as well as my network. And I think that's just a reality that people have to accept. But absolutely, working at an early stage startup, your job security is less tied to the company than a larger company. So again, if you're someone that's like, and it's all going to depend what I get it. If you're like on your own, you have huge rent bills to pay and a ton of debt, that becomes something that's a little bit harder to do than maybe if you're in a different financial position, or as you get older, it's easier to do. I have a partner who's quite stable. So if I'm without work for a couple months because I'm in between jobs, I'm fortunate to be in a position where I'm not really worried about my bills for a few months anyways. And not everyone's in that position.
Right. That's amazing. I think it's important too that, the networking, it's huge now, especially with obviously in lieu of the pandemic and everything. Did you see kind of a major shift or a change within the tech sector over the past year and a half? Or do you just find that it's growing at a predictable rate? Or was there any kind of thing that caught you off guard?
Yeah, so definitely when COVID hit, I think tech companies fell into two camps. They either, especially startups, because it's just like all of a sudden you're like, whoa, is anyone going to buy our product? Like, what's happening to the world? So, they either kind of laid people off and kind of hunkered down and just tried to like weather the storm, so to speak, or anticipated storm, because who knew what the world would be, how long we'd be in this, what, the lockdown would look like. So there's those people. And then there's those people that didn't really notice anything. They might've like paused for a couple of weeks because they're like, oh, should we be hiring someone right now? I don't know. But they just kind of kept on going, or they weren't really hiring and growing anyways. And they just stayed stable. And that was definitely the beginning of the pandemic. I'd say for the first couple of quarters of 2020, I think then the tech sector overall, like any other sector, it really depended what you were in. So if you were developing software for the hospitality industry, you might have been a little bit more affected. We actually just hired our account executive. Dallas was a founder, and he's still got his business going on, but the pandemic really affected his business. And ultimately he kind of got it down to like a very low maintenance level. And now he's working for us full-time as an employee. So some were affected, some weren't, but overall, I would say the tech sector has been pretty resilient. I think jobs especially weren't really affected just because people can work anywhere, and there was tons of companies still hiring during the pandemic, which I found really interesting. So there was still tons of companies hiring, maybe not for the first couple months. Like I said, everyone's like, whoa, what should we do here? But it's totally hiring. There's tons of VC money. So tech startups are getting a ton of money right now. Also with that shift to remote work, more companies can hire more people. So Shopify, for example, huge tech company here in Canada, you guys have all probably heard of it. They just said, we're going to hire 2,000 developers in 2020 and, or 2021. And like, they don't require anyone to go to an office anymore. So they can now hire someone in Nelson, BC, or on Gabriel Island, BC, or they can hire someone in Ottawa. And that person in Ottawa might have access to an office, but the person in Nelson and Gabriela get to work for Shopify and all the perks that come with that, just from their own home country. So there's a lot of shifting that's going on as a result of the pandemic. I think it's for the better. As an HR person, definitely my talent can go have more job opportunities. So, we have to work on retention. That's really important. But I get to the privilege of hiring people from outside of Vancouver now, which is really great, which makes hiring more interesting, a little bit easier, more exciting, and leveraging people's different skill sets.
Yeah. And so you mentioned you do the recruiting and stuff. Is there, because like you said, it's a lot of networking and personality and kind of, these are the skills I have and I want to do this. Is there anything that kind of stands out to you when you go through the resumes, or you get that little nudge of a message saying, Charlyne, I'm here and I'm ready?
Yeah. I mean, so the first thing is, why do you want to work for us? Right? It's that passion. And so I get it. Like if you're technical, our product's very technical. So that passion's a little bit easier to align. If our product's not technical, that's cool. I only get our product so much. It's extremely technical and I'm pretty comfortable with technology, but it's pretty tough. But it's like, well, then what else has got you excited about it? Is it because, we're a startup that's really exciting? Have you read some news about us that you like? Is it that you think our founders really accomplished? We actually were an incredibly strong executive team of people who are startup people. And, that's a huge strength. So someone messaged me and was like, I think your executive team is amazing. Everyone's resume is ridiculous. I'd love to work with you people. Like that's really, you showed me passion for our company. And, I'm going to ask you why, so make sure it's real. And cause I'm going to dig in a little bit to your statements, but that kind of stuff is really good. I think also I love when people tell me their story. So I, on my job posting, say a cover letter is appreciated because I actually care less about your experience. We'll figure that out in the interview process, but we want people who are entrepreneurial. We want people who maybe started their own companies and failed. So somebody, and that's all my job postings. So please read the job postings and respond appropriately. I do ask for that information. So if you're applying, you haven't attached a cover letter, all I have is like, yeah, you're a new grad. Here's a project. Cool. But if you attach a cover letter and you're like, this is my journey. This is who I am as a human. Like, here's my excitement. Here's why I love what you guys are doing. Here's what I'm wanting to get out of my career. Like, wow, like I'm excited to talk to you. And we still got to figure out if there's a place for you on the bus, but at least you're going to probably get a phone call from me, or at least an email, or like I said, what can you bring to the table? What can you pitch me that you can do to better our business? I'm probably going to listen, and I'm probably going to follow up because I don't get those very often.
Yeah. People in tech are not robots themselves.
No, exactly. Especially not the HR people.
No. And then I guess for our final question, this one was submitted a couple times and it's, I think, important. And you've given so much like amazing advice. I loved your session. And I think the audience really is just kind of that final, like last piece of advice, or that final, like little note to remember in the back of your head when entering into the startups.
Yeah. So what to kind of know in the back of your head. So, I mean, I think, like I said, just in general job seeking advice, there's no decision to make until you literally have a job offer in front of you. So if you're interested in exploring startups, just go for it. And some of it's probably just going to be practicing talking to people or networking. So just do it. When you actually are going through an interview process, or you're having kind of those coffees and talking about the role, don't be afraid to ask lots of questions. It is about matchmaking, and it is about realities. And when I was at Lighthouse Labs and I ran the career services department, I used to use dating analogies a lot for our job seekers. So it's really about you really understanding the dating profile, and you get a chance to ask the questions. And then it's just about you deciding if that feels like a good fit or not. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to kind of like explore things. And, at the end of the day, you can't make a career mistake this early on. Like, fine, if you join a company, you stay there for 5 years, maybe you'll get pigeonholed in some little role, but that won't happen to a startup. And if you lose your job, oh, well, if you're comfortable with that, oh, well, or taking that risk, like you go on to the next one and you take that experience with you. And again, like for me, I'm like, oh, you worked at a startup and you lost your job and you're coming back to me. Like, you're more desirable as a candidate than the person who's only worked at a big company, because one, that journey to losing your job at a startup is a lot of change and a lot of things going on in the background that you clearly handled. You clearly were okay with weathering that storm, so to speak, and you came back for more. So check. Are you a startup person? I think so. And so that experience can actually be more desirable on your job hunt afterwards. So I just really think you can't go wrong. I to be 20 again, to be in my early 20s or my first job, again, you can't go wrong. And this is the time to figure out what you love and what you don't. And sometimes the only way to do that is to go in. If you are a generalist, like if you are more of a business generalist, I absolutely would encourage you to really consider startups, just because it's such a great way to get exposure to all the areas of business and maybe like figure out what you want to do on the job. And it's easy to pivot from like HR to sales or receptionist, general admin into accounting or into project management or product management or UX design. Like the ability to move in departments in a startup is huge. So if you haven't really figured out what you want to do or haven't done like accounting or software development where it's very specialized, a startup's a really great place to kind of figure things out and get exposed to business in a way you can't do anywhere else. And again, you have to be willing to take on all those realities I talked about.
Yeah. And I think it's important too, because you mentioned like a jack of all trades, you're wearing all these different hats. And I think it's just a great opportunity to kind of find yourself and see where you are in this world of commerce.
Totally. Yeah. I always tell people in HR, because I've been an HR generalist my whole life. And I think starting as a generalist recruitment coordinator is often the first job you get. But it doesn't mean you can't pay attention to what else is going on in your department, right? And if you can get just a generalist, admin, HR assistant or HR coordinator, you get exposed to all the areas of HR to figure out what you like and what you don't like. And it's so valuable for